The ANC says it will meet today's 5 o'clock deadline to hand over records of its cadre deployment committee meetings to the Democratic Alliance. That's per the order of the Constitutional Court. The Apex Court dismissed the ANC's petition to appeal last week. The party had approached the court hoping to overturn a decision by the Supreme Court of Appeal that it hands over the documents to the official opposition. The governing party has now sought to assure the public that it will abide by the court's decision and will hand over all related documents in its possession by close of business today. All right, let's bring in the DA spokesperson for public administration, Dr. Leon Schreiber. Thanks very much indeed for coming on. Thanks for joining us. The ANC says that, these records are nothing new. These were records that the party already handed over to the state capture inquiry, records dating as far back as 2018 to 2021. And even back then, no minutes of the meetings of the deployment committee going as far back to 2012, the period 2012 to 2017, could be found. What do you make of that?
Well, good afternoon, Michelle, and to the viewers. Well, that's why the DA's application in this matter asks for so much more than just those meeting minutes. You will recall from the Constitutional Court order that affirmed the High Court's original order that the ANC must not hand over only meeting minutes, but must hand over email discussions, WhatsApp discussions, CVs that they considered, and any other documentation relevant to the work of the deployment committee. These are things that go back much further than 2018, and it's clear that the ANC, both in front of the Zondo Commission and throughout this court process, has desperately sought to hide President Ramaphosa's involvement in state capture through cadre deployment from the public. That is why they are now saying that the records prior to 2018 don't exist, because that's the period when the president was the chairman of the deployment committee. And I will just also share with the viewers one interesting fact. If you look at the deployment committee minutes that were handed over to the Zondo Commission, the very first item of the very first minute is the adoption of the previous meeting's minutes. So we know it is not true to claim that those things don't exist. There are minutes from an earlier period. And in any case, we have asked for much more than just meeting minutes. Right.
Look, the ANC in its statement, and I have that statement here in front of me from today, the ANC calls out the DA's political gaslighting on cadre deployment is the topic of the ANC's statement. And it says, in his testimony to the Zondo Commission, the President Cyril Ramaphosa, committed that the ANC would do everything in its power to find those shall we call them missing records. The party has now had 3 years to do so. It's 2024. If indeed the ANC does come up empty for that particular period when President Cyril Ramaphosa was deputy president and was then heading up the cadre deployment committee, what happens then, Leon?
Well, I think the first point to make is that the ANC is clearly in a bit of a panic now, if you read that particular statement. And if it were true that President Ramaphosa or the ANC were committed to transparency on this matter, then I simply ask, why did the DA have to fight for 3 years in the High Court, in the Supreme Court of Appeal, and ultimately in the Constitutional Court to make this public? In all three of those cases, the DA won with a cost order against the ANC, which means that they have been prepared to spend a substantial amount of money defending and delaying against the DA's request for transparency on this matter. So they are simply not being truthful. They've done everything in their power to hide these records. When it comes to what we may end up finding in these records, of course, we would have to go through that with a fine-tooth comb, which is exactly what we will do once we get them. But if there is any attempt at obfuscation, at continuing to hide critical information, or indeed to not comply with the Constitutional Court's ruling, then the DA will go back to court for an order of contempt against the ANC. And it's very important to keep in mind the precedent that was created in the Zuma matter, where Mr. Zuma was sent to prison for exactly this offense, being in contempt of the Constitutional Court. So whatever the ANC does, the DA will not relent on this front, because we have been fighting for years now to come to a point where we can abolish cadre deployment, given the fundamental role it plays in state capture, in corruption, and in failing service delivery that we all experience through load shedding, water shedding, and job shedding.
I want to continue reading excerpts from the statement and just get your reaction to it, because the ANC says certain precautions have been taken insofar as the release of these records are concerned, so that it can comply with the provisions of the Protection of Personal Information Act, the POPI Act. And this is specifically, the party says, for those persons who have not given consent for the release of these documents. So essentially the ANC says it needs to protect the private information of certain individuals because they haven't given permission for the release of this information. In your understanding of the law, as a holder of public office in a case like this, would the POPI Act apply?
Well, I can say to you, I've just consulted with our legal team again, and if this is the route that the ANC chooses to take, we will meet them right back in court once again, because there are two critical things that we need to point out here. First of all, the ANC, throughout 3 years of court processes in 3 different courts, never once raised this particular defense, never once raised this particular issue, and as you know, once a court has ruled, you are unable to introduce new arguments on the same matter. So they will be in very deep legal trouble once again if they pursue this particular route. But secondly, once again, the highest court in the land has applied its mind to this case. It has applied its mind not to an abstract request. It has applied its mind to the concrete request which the DA has made, which is for full unredacted records of cadre deployment committee meeting minutes, of CVs that were considered, of email threads, of WhatsApp conversations. The reason that the DA won all of these cases is because all of the information contained in those records are in the public interest. Mm-hmm. The ANC loses its ability to hide behind a veil of secrecy as a private organization precisely because it uses cadre deployment to interfere in public sector appointments, and ultimately that impacts on the services that the public receives. Therefore, the public has a right to know, and that is the guiding principle in this case.
Right. The thing is, it's not unique to the ANC, is it, cadre deployment? It's not unique to South Africa either. The ANC in its statement saying that it's meant to advance transformation. Many other countries around the world do it. In fact, political parties do it. The DA itself does it, Leon, where it identifies certain individuals with certain skills and appoints them to particular positions. So for those of us who have been living under a rock, perhaps it's a good time for you to explain why the DA has been going out of its way to get these cadre deployment records, why it's a particular case that relates not only to the fact that this is a practice done worldwide, but why it's so important right here in South Africa. And just before you answer, the ANC does in its statement also say it acknowledges that some past deployments have been problematic.
Let's just start with that last statement. If this was a matter of isolated instances of incompetent or corrupt people being appointed, then we would not have had systemic corruption and systemic failure of service delivery across the board. It is very clear if you look at any report from the Auditor General, from Parliament, from anything else, that South Africa faces state failure across the board, state-owned enterprises, government departments, etc. So it is very clear that we have a systemic problem, and that means that there is a systemic cause. And the DA has identified very clearly cadre deployment as a key systemic cause of state failure and corruption in South Africa, precisely because it influences appointments across the board. And that results in the appointment of people who are then implicated in corruption and state failure. I think it's very important to make the point that political parties do have the right, and that is true across the board, to identify people for political office. So when you're talking about a president, a premier, a minister, a councillor, an MEC or a mayor, those are clearly political positions. And if you look at the Public Service Act, Section 12A of the Act identifies a small group of ring-fenced appointments that political office bearers can make on the grounds of political considerations. So here you can think of a chief of staff, a spokesperson, and other people in a minister's office, for example. Where ANC cadre deployment crosses the line and goes beyond accepted good practice around the world is that it extends the influence of political loyalty into the administration. So that's your director generals, And we see from the minutes that were submitted to the Zondo Commission, even middle managers are sometimes selected through the deployment process. The same goes for state-owned enterprises, and we even know that the ANC has provincial and regional deployment committees which interfere in appointments of municipal managers and provincial officials as well. So what this is ultimately about is about the most basic democratic principle of the separation between party and state. Political parties are well within their rights to manage political appointments and political office bearer selection. They have no right to interfere in the administration, and specifically not the right to select loyal cadres on the basis of their service to a political party rather than on the basis of their ability to deliver for all South Africans.
Certainly. Gwede Mantashe, the ANC's national chairperson, in the State of the Nation address debate last week in Parliament, took to the podium and said that the DA can do what it likes and that the ANC will continue with cadre deployment because it advances the goal of transformation ultimately. So what happens after today, after 5 p.m. today, when you have the records in your possession, however far back those records may go? Surely it's not enough that you just have these records. What would be the next step?
First of all, we will look through them with a fine-tooth comb, as I say, and we will identify potential actionable steps flowing from them. So where there's evidence of illegal conduct or anything else that we're able to identify, you can rest assured that we will take appropriate action. But I do want to say to Mr. Mantashe's breathtakingly arrogant statement that he is about to run into a brick wall on this case, because the DA is not only fighting to expose cadre deployment records, we are also currently awaiting a ruling from the Pretoria High Court to declare cadre deployment unconstitutional and unlawful. So unless the ANC is saying that they will refuse to abide by the rulings of our courts, should they lose that case, and continue with cadre deployment come hell or high water, then they are going to be forced through the work of the Democratic Alliance to abolish this practice, because as I say, we will not have success against corruption. We will not have a capable state that is capable of delivering for all South Africans unless we replace cadre deployment with merit-based appointments where we look for skilled officials who can actually do the job rather than cadres. That is why it is a key commitment in the DA's manifesto as well.
Leon Schreiber, Dr. Leon Schreiber, let me thank you for your time. The DA spokesperson for public administration. It is D-Day for the ANC to hand over those cadre deployment records to the party. It's got until close of business today, and that's a deadline that the ANC says it will indeed meet.